Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 16th of July. We have a lot to cover today, starting with Krasnohorivka, then going to Brudivka, Novoslivka Persha, and Lozuvatske, and we'll finish off by looking at the Toretsk direction. I'm not feeling that well, so for the first time in the channel's history, we're actually going to keep the video short. And we're going to begin by looking at Krasnohorivka, where I'm zooming in right now. You can see that the Russians have continued their gradual push into the northwestern corner of the town based on a new geolocation from July 14th, indicating that there was a Ukrainian FPV strike on a house located about, I think it was 200 meters away from the previous established line of contact from what we understood to be the case. And so you could see how there is this very gradual push by the Russians, but any sort of advance here does take time because you do need to clear out all the basements. And once you step foot within an area that's in the lion's den, an area that is exposed, then you do have a large amount of Ukrainian FPV crews, because every single brigade and battalion here does have a drone crew attached to it. And so they really are involved in the operations to just slow down individual Russian squads. And you could see that, for instance, by the fact that an entire drone group from a unit that isn't even located in Krasnohorivka was moved to operate around here, because the 100 Mechanized Brigade is operating further northwards in the region around Novoolexandrivka, but the drone unit is operating here. And I do think the reason why is because of this continued Russian push through the private residential areas. And speaking of the unit composition here, I won't get into too much detail, but there is an investigation that the Ukrainians have opened, specifically Sirsky. He's opened an inspection into the 59th Brigade. If you recall, then I always talk about how the 9th Battalion of that brigade is actually defending Krasnohorivka, while the rest of the unit, including the 11th Battalion, is defending further north, not around Novelska necessarily anymore, but more so in regions like Karlivka, Brudivka, and so they do have a role in this general sector southwest of the Avdiivka theater. The commander of the 59th Brigade is Bogdan Shevchuk, and he's being accused of a whole host of malpractices, including careerism, and then putting his own troops in unnecessary danger. And it's interesting because this is the second case against a high-ranking commander that has been filed by the general milieu of the Azov sphere, specifically the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade. And a lot of the people that are within that current National Guard Brigade, they previously served in Azovstal. And so they're filing these complaints and calling out some individuals that actually did have high ranks, like Yuri Sodol, who we talked about last month. And he was commander of the joint forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. And it was actually the head of the 12th Brigade that publicly spoke out against him. And it appears that that was sort of unprecedented at the time, and now it's becoming more normalized. And so they're going after other leadership that they deem to not be doing a sufficient job in protecting the soldiers. And while we're on the topic of the 59th Brigade, let's look at Brudivka, which is a village where there is some presence of the units, but you also have several other units like the 56th and the 53rd that are trying to maintain control for as long as possible of this Karlivka bridgehead. That's how I refer to it. And so now you finally have admissions from deep state of a Russian presence within the village, something that we knew for weeks now, but more recently we got additional confirmation based on new geolocations. And so if we're just taking the latest Petrenko map, for instance, then you could see how it's an advance of about 1 kilometer to the northwest. And it does show now the Russians are in the process of clearing out this really small hamlets, but the Ukrainian resistance is the reason why it hasn't been taken over yet, because you did have a lot of resources being moved in across this bridge. And some of them, of course, were targeted recently by the Russians. This is from July 14th. Russian FPVs destroying, it's not a Russian, it's a Ukrainian BMP-2 on the Karlivka crossing. And that's one of the issues with moving basically equipment, but also men through this region. You do have a lot of DPR drone-oriented units here. And in a similar fashion to the Ukrainian side, they really are 24/7 active near the line of contact. And in a choke point like this, they do try to take advantage of it. And so that's just one of the downsides. But for the time being, there are still active engagements in the hamlets. Same thing goes with Novoslivka Persha, where we do have some important updates, including the fact that the Russian forces were able to advance slightly further to the west now. We could look at the extent of the advance. It amounts to about 500 meters, if I recall correctly. something like this. And so the Russian forces have continued pushing westwards through the fields that are, again, just to the west of this vertical road connecting Persia to Umanske. And so you can see how the Russian forces, while they're conducting their main axis through the northern parts of the village, they are at the same time duly advancing through this southern part, this southern field region over here, which is on a hill. And I've said it, I think, now 3 videos in a row. It overlooks the tributary that extends into Novoslivka Persha, and then overlooks all of the nearby frontline villages that you see written over here. And it does not overlook the trenches that you see in yellow, but it does overlook some of the hinterlands between them and the crossings past the Vovcha River to the eastern bank. Now, within Novoslivka Persha itself, we do have an advance, if we're measuring it, that amounts to about 1.2 kilometers to the southwest. This is due to now confirmation based on Russian sources releasing this video from July 16th. It's a very interesting video because it confirms to us now for the first time that there has been engagements between the new inmate battalion in the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the Russian forces. So this past week, we received compilation footage from that unit, this unit that is composed entirely of inmates, and this is not the first time it's happened. We talked in an earlier video about how the 24th Mechanized Brigade, which is defending at the moment around Chasiv Yar, they created their own all-prisoner battalion. So now the 47th has created one of their own. There's also about 6 others that have done it. So it's called the Shkaval Battalion, and in their ceremony, which again, it's entirely composed of inmates that were given parole in order to fight on the front lines. And we talked about the specifics of who is eligible and how many have already applied, which now I believe it's 5,000 that have been granted parole, and then about 37,000 who may be eligible, or actually 27,000 who may be eligible under the new law to end up applying and receive parole. But now the ones that have been given that are beginning to get absorbed into exclusively inmate battalions or into general battalions, general regular units, like in the case of the 3rd Assault Brigade, where they're not differentiating between prisoners and just former civilian non-criminals. In any case, we now know that the Shkaval Battalion engaged in holding the northern flank of Novoslivka Persha a couple of days ago with Bradleys. They were given those vehicles to fire towards the Russian line of contact, towards the tree lines, and that was around July 12th released. So they were sent in to very quickly fill the gaps right after they completed their 2 months of training. And so they were thrown immediately into one of the heaviest parts of the front line with the heaviest fighting. And now we see this video from the Russian side where they were able to push through the local school, push through some of the residential areas, and reach pretty deep into it. And they were able to capture 2 members of the 47th Brigade, 2 former inmates. That's what's being claimed by the Russian side. And you could see in the video how they're engaging in house-to-house combat with the Ukrainian side. 2 of the Ukrainians come out and they're taken as POW, and then you just have continued fighting, shooting by the Russians into a house where the Ukrainians were operating within. And what it shows is that the Ukrainians really needed those inmates to help fill in gaps in the front line because they were immediately sent in as vanguard filler reinforcements, which is interesting because there are so many units on paper here that should be defending, but it was Shkaval Battalion that immediately received the most difficult task, obviously not on its own, but even being included in it says a lot. Now, when we're looking at the rest of the village, it is severely compromised because the Russian forces have now gotten control over the sort of T-junction, not really a T-junction, but you can see what I refer to, where now they've cut off access from this western crossing that I'm marking in red to again, then go further south and connect with the rest of the Ukrainian-controlled part of the village. And so there's really only one real route into Persha, and it is very close to the line of contact. And then you just have maybe 50% of the village that remains under firm Ukrainian control and is currently being enveloped from the north, pushes from the northeast to a lesser extent, and then this flanking attempt from the south. Now here in Prokhorez, I don't have much to expound upon. It's just that we now have additional information confirming a Russian gain of about 700 meters westwards into the village itself. The Russians are now awfully close to reaching its eastern outskirts. They're about 500 meters away from reaching it. And so you can see how basically every single day there's been this streamline of Russian infantry pushing one by one along tree lines and fields. And it's being done in a systematic nature. and now they are just very close to reaching these final villages that are along the river. Further north, they have already reached into the village of Lozuvatske. This is a village that I dare I say it's just a hamlet or collection of barns or whatever and trees. So you could see here marked from July 16th, there was a Russian BMP that made its way all the way into the premises of the hamlet, and it was hit by a Ukrainian artillery barrage. It was able to avoid the shelling, but then it was hit by an FPV that we don't have the after damage, but it was hit by the FPV. And that again confirms to us that the furthest Russian extent of an advance in this region is about, if we measure it, about 1 kilometer to the west from where they were previously located. So for a while now, there's been engagement with Russian vehicles here. Russian vehicles are more present here than they are in other sectors in this general theater. I think that's because there's more open fields here that are not necessarily adjacent to villages. Like we're talking about this entire hill over here that the Russians are trying to advance through, where they have this elevation advantage overlooking the tributary on which Lozuvatske is located, tributary extending out of the Toretsk River. And so now it's very difficult to see where the Ukrainians could even lodge to maintain a frontline presence over here as the Russians just continue pushing into the hamlet, and then from there have a direct route into the Toretsk River Valley, including into Timofivka and all of the nearby villages. Now here's something rather interesting. I paused the video because I had a feeling that there may have been an update from this region, and it actually appears that the Russian forces have now captured the entirety of its premises, including the nearby pond region and the forested region, per reporting from Deep State, which does indicate that the Russian forces have advanced about 600, 700 meters away from the previous geolocation that I marked for you guys. And the unit that is utilized by the Ukrainians defending here is the 110th Mechanized Brigade. If you recall, they were heavily involved in defending the northern flank of the Avdiivka sector for a while, and once again, they have been recommitted to the front line to be involved in defensive work over here. But now you see how the Russian forces have created the salient. They have the same thing going on in Novoalexandrivka with a very dangerous salient all the way to Vovcha, which has not been repelled and has not been contained for the time being as the Russians continue advancing incrementally every day. And now that basically spells the end for any sort of Ukrainian presence within these fields in between the two salients, which means the Russian forces will control the extension of the local hill from the rail embankment further to the southeast. That overlooks both the river valley to the north of it, which is the one that I'm marking in red that runs through Baranivka, which is a very important river valley that includes various villages that the Ukrainians control near the front line. And as I said before, the Toretsk River Valley, which includes Timofivka, Lyshishnya, and various other villages. Now, moving on to the Toretsk axis, we're going to begin with New York, where we also had recent updates with the Ukrainians being pushed out of the entirety of this southwestern district of New York. And when we say southwestern, it's not to sort of claim that it's isolated from the rest of the village. It is actually so close to the heart of New York. The only thing separating it is this very narrow Toretsk River and then an open field amounting to 200 meters. And so capturing this district gives you a perfect springboard to then push into the rest of the city, where you do have these massive industrial facilities, the cultural center, fire station, and all the main plazas. And so really the advances here are critical for the fate of the rest of New York. And so the Russian forces have advanced about 600 meters to the northeast, capturing these various facilities and structures that you see marked here. They pushed and captured some of these duplexes recently when they developed their initial sort of breakthrough in this region. And then there was a period of maybe a week and a half where there was a bit of stabilization in this region, which is to be expected when you move in a significant amount of resources, including a very important assault battalion Scala with large drone presence, and then, certain mechanized elements like the 41st Mechanized Brigade. And so I wouldn't be too surprised if, at the very least, the Ukrainian and Russian garrisons that are fighting in New York are at the same level of manpower. It could even be that the Ukrainians have slightly more manpower in this region, given the influx of reinforcements, if we're to say that the entire brigade was moved into the same area, which we can't say for sure. Because if you look at it, there are two units that are operating generally in New York for the Russian side, the 9th and the 132nd Brigades. And they are also split up between New York and Toretsk further north. And so it's not complete. There may also be elements with the veterans PMC. And that's basically it for this entire 20, 25 kilometer wide sector, and then you have various other Ukrainian reinforcements that were sent in just recently, but has not been enough to fully stop the Russian advances, as the Russians do still have the momentum and do still have that offensive capacity, which we saw manifest by them getting control of additional portions of the gray zone just to the southeast of New York. So you could see that with an advance amounting to about 700, 800 meters northwards, which we see over here, the Russian forces advancing directly from this eastern axis into the, I guess, just east of center parts of New York, which is such a critical area because it's the connector between the wider Ukrainian defensive structures that you see over here and the frontline trenches that you see defending here in yellow that are still holding, although they're now in a compromised position, trying to hold back any sort of Russian push from Horivka and Shiroka Balka, which is not occurring at the moment, but the Ukrainians here, to our knowledge at least, are still present. And so it does have raised questions about the integrity of any sort of long-term defenses in those regions. And so we know the Ukrainians were pushed back here because they published this video of an FPV strike on 6 Russian soldiers in a squad that were able to enter a house and then were targeted by an FPV drone. So again, that shows you there is a very active Ukrainian drone presence in this region. Likewise, you have this video which was geolocated to be near this tree line just to the southeast of the main Russian vector of advance, and it's a Ukrainian Max Pro MRAP. I'm assuming they wanted to dismount forces near the line of contact to engage in defensive activities or maybe retake a local trench. And so the FPV spotted it near a tree line and then destroyed it. And that should give you an idea of the fighting over there. Now, when it comes to the New York sector, if we zoom out, after, I don't know if it's a week or just less than that, but we've known for a while now that the Russian forces have been able to penetrate into Zalizhny. And when I drew the mapping of it, I indicated that they advanced from the eastern suburbs over here of Zalizhny and then just directly crossed over the fields into these houses over here. And now Ukrainian sources, they are claiming that the actual vector of attack didn't occur through that region, but that the Russian forces utilized their strategic positions in areas just around Pivdenia or north of it and advanced along these horizontal-esque roads directly into the district from there in a region that is also located on a local heights, because if you look at the vectors of advance for the Russians, if we were to say the Russians advanced from the eastern Zalizhny suburbs from here, then it's an extension of the heights that start north of Shumi. But at the same time, the Russian advance that occurs from Pivdenia into Zalizhny from the southeast is also basically occurring along a local ridge. And so in any case, the Russian forces are trying to continue advancing along the high ground and continue to overlook Ukrainian positions in trenches that are located further south or in residential areas that are generally being overlooked from those same heights. And so I just made that same adjustment, but it doesn't change the fact that we have geolocation from the center of the Zalizhny suburb. What has changed since then is the fact that the Russian forces have been able to advance. Let's see it actually advance about 500 meters westwards into deeper into Druzhba and Pivnishnya. We can see this based on a video which is just a compilation from the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. One of the reinforcement units moved into here, and they conducted a litany of FPV strikes, drone drops onto Russian soldiers in dugouts, houses, various machine gun posts, equipment hubs, whatever it may be. They just tried spotting everything and throughout daytime struck the advancing Russian forces, which again does play a role in disincentivizing large attacks and from pushing deep at a singular moment. But at the same time, it confirms to us that the Russian forces are continuing to push over here and have secured this specific region under their control. And that again does further undermine this railroad access for the Ukrainians and does put in danger their line of defense, which is running along this highway and then goes further south along this sort of southwestern oriented road into the apartment complex. It could be flanked potentially from this sort of northern routes, and that's a big issue that the Ukrainians need to contain the situation of, but that is more so looking into the future. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.